The galaxy was quiet the night the alarms began to rise, a silence too heavy to be trusted, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. Across dozens of systems, watchtowers, and relay stations picked up a single human phrase, a string of words harmless on their own yet terrifying when spoken by the strange species from Sol. "Hold my beer." The signal was faint, little more than background noise at first, but once confirmed, it spread like fire through the channels of the Galactic Council. The warning lights lit crimson in every command center. Emergency klaxons rang in war fleets, and entire planets shifted their defenses to maximum alert. Old races that had survived the collapse of empires, that had outlasted supernovae and devoured weaker civilizations, now trembled at the thought of humanity preparing to act without restraint. The memory of what had happened the last time was still raw, carved into the records of every species. The Drakthar still mourned the loss of their supercarrier, a vessel that had been considered indestructible until one battered human frigate had turned it into a graveyard of burning steel. No one could explain how it had been done, not even the humans themselves, because the plan had been born from madness and desperation, from a reckless dare that no machine or elder council would ever consider logical. That was what made the humans so dangerous. They were a people who looked at the impossible and said, "Why not?" Tonight the same spark had been lit again. On the jungle world of Xiron, a council of insectoid generals stopped their feast mid-ritual and hissed in fear. On the icy citadel of the Varaxi Empire, armored warriors gathered in silence, their antennae twitching with unease. Even the ancient and calculated minds of the machine intellects paused their endless equations to run new probabilities, only to find that the chaos of humanity broke every model. The words "hold my beer" had become something larger than language, something closer to a galactic omen. Like the tolling of a bell before disaster, they meant that a human had reached the edge of reason and chosen to step past it, armed not with certainty but with courage, madness, and the raw will to defy the universe itself. On Earth, no one outside the command decks of the fleet even understood the weight of those words. To them it was a joke, a phrase said in bars before a stunt, before a dare, before proving something could be done. But the galaxy had learned to fear it, because every time the humans said it, something extraordinary followed. Sometimes extraordinary meant brilliant victory. Sometimes it meant catastrophe that burned half a star system. Either way, it was never predictable, never safe, and never within the rules of war that other species obeyed. As the transmission spread, the elder races whispered their old warnings. Do not underestimate the children of Sol. Do not test their stubbornness. Do not stand too close when they gamble with fate. Entire fleets were recalled from patrol duty. Shield generators flared to life on border worlds, and outposts sealed their gates, not against humanity itself, but against the storm humanity was about to unleash. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, a single human commander had spoken the cursed words, and the universe leaned forward in dread, waiting to see what kind of madness would come next. Commander Alex Mercer stood inside the command deck of the human dreadnought Endeavor, his eyes fixed on the glowing map that showed the movement of enemy ships across the black ocean of space. The map was a storm of red markers, so many that the blue dots representing the human fleet looked like sparks about to be drowned in a fire. The Zorath Armada had come without warning, sweeping across the border like a wave of knives, their ships vast and sleek, their weapons slicing apart everything in their path. Reports came in faster than anyone could answer them. Colonies burning, defense stations shattered, fighters torn to dust before they could even launch. Mercer felt the weight of it pressing down on him, heavier than the ship's hull, heavier than the silence of the crew who stood waiting for orders. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and by every logical measure already defeated. Beside him, Lieutenant Arya Chen whispered what everyone knew, but no one wanted to say aloud. Her voice thin as a ghost in the smoke-filled air. "We can't win this." The words struck harder than any weapon, but Mercer did not answer right away, his jaw tight as he stared at the shifting stars on the screen. Humanity was new to the galactic stage, barely 5 years into the Council, mocked by older races for their crude ships and clumsy politics, seen as children playing at war in a galaxy where empires had fought for millennia. The humans had come late, with technology stitched together by stubborn engineers and fleets built more from hope than resources. Yet they had already made enemies who saw Earth as soft, rich, and ripe for conquest. Now the Zorath wanted everything, oceans, skies, and soil, and they were ready to grind humanity into dust to take it. The silence on the deck grew heavier as the crew looked to their commander, searching for something beyond fear. Mercer finally exhaled, slow and steady, and spoke words that froze every ear that heard them. "Hold my beer." He had not said them loud, but the bridge caught the phrase like a spark, and even before Arya snapped her head toward him with wide eyes, the weight of it was already spreading beyond the walls of the ship. The crew shifted in disbelief, some choking back nervous laughter, others staring as though he had just cursed the stars themselves. Arya's voice shook, a mixture of horror and resignation. "Oh no, you didn't just—" But Mercer cut her off with a sharp nod, his voice as calm as the void. "Yes, I did." Those 3 words rang out stronger than alarms, stronger than the hum of the engines. Somewhere far away, across relays and hidden channels, the phrase reached the wider galaxy. Old races who had seen this before stiffened with dread. Command centers turned red with warnings, and even machines rewrote their threat codes. Everyone knew what was coming because humanity had spoken the words that meant logic was about to be abandoned, rules were about to be broken, and the impossible was about to be attempted. On the Endeavor, the crew straightened, some shaking their heads in disbelief, some hiding smiles that flickered with the madness of hope. For the first time that night, they looked less like prey waiting for the hunter's blade and more like wolves baring their teeth in the dark. The odds were still impossible, the enemy still overwhelming, but the phrase had changed the air, as though the stars themselves had shifted. The galaxy was right to be afraid because when humans said, "Hold my beer," it meant that the fight had only just begun. The plan that Commander Mercer gave his fleet was not the kind of plan any trained officer in the galaxy would have accepted, and yet as his words spread through the ships of the Terran defense, through engineers, miners, and pilots who had never seen real battle before, it lit a fire in them that no sane strategy could. The humans had almost nothing compared to the Zorath Armada, no grand warships, no ancient star forges, no endless supplies of fuel and weapons, and so Mercer turned to what humanity had always turned to in times of desperation: imagination, madness, and the things no one else thought could ever matter. Mining ships, freighters, colony transports, even old atmospheric shuttles were pulled from their quiet duty and dragged into orbit to be stripped, welded and reforged into something that might just survive long enough to hurt the enemy. In asteroid belts and shipyards across the system, torches flared, welders sweated, and laughter mixed with curses as civilians and soldiers worked side by side to turn scraps into armor and cargo haulers into weapons. Where the Zorath relied on precision fleets built for perfect formation, the humans created chaos, a storm of ships that looked more like junkyards given engines than a navy. When Mercer explained that the heart of the plan was to hurl asteroids at near light speed straight into the enemy lines, even the most loyal captains thought he had lost his mind. He called it Project Baseball, a name no alien understood, a word that sounded too soft for war. But every human in the fleet grinned when they heard it, because it carried with it the promise of a strike so wild and so powerful that it would rewrite the odds. The Council allies who listened in disbelief sent warnings, calling the plan reckless and certain death, but Mercer only smiled that stubborn human smile and said, "Not reckless, creative." And when one alien commander accused him of asking miners to become kamikazes, Mercer shook his head and answered, "I'm asking them to become heroes." Warp coils meant for small jumps were ripped out of freighters and strapped to asteroids, the cores glowing too hot, their stability already fraying, yet no one stopped. Plasma warheads, some banned by interstellar law, were wired to rocks larger than cities, their surfaces glowing under the hands of engineers who dared not blink. Children in the colonies painted flags on the sides of the makeshift ships, crude drawings of Earth, of wolves, of fists raised in defiance, as if their small hands could give courage to the steel. The galaxy watched in silence as the humans prepared, their machines calculating survival chances so low they might as well have been zero. But the humans did not care. They sang while they worked. They told jokes even as they strapped themselves into unarmored shuttles. And when someone complained about the madness of it, the others only laughed and answered with the phrase that had already become legend: "Hold my beer." The Varaxi generals called it suicide. The Drakthar predators mocked it until they remembered the supercarrier. And the machine intellects could not fit the variables into their logic trees. Yet beneath all that fear and disbelief there was a hidden truth the galaxy had never admitted. Humans had always been most dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. And now, With their world at stake and their fleet already facing doom, they had decided to gamble everything on one impossible throw, a strike so wild it could only come from the madness of Earth. The battle began at the edge of Jupiter's orbit, a stretch of dark space filled with the quiet majesty of the gas giant and its swirling storms. But that beauty was lost the moment the Zorath Armada arrived. Their ships cut through the void like blades, thousands of them moving in perfect formation, black and silver hulls glimmering under distant starlight, their engines leaving trails that looked like scars across the night. The human fleet, patched together from warships, miners, haulers, and shuttles, looked small and broken in comparison, a swarm of rust compared to a wall of steel, and the crew of the Endeavor could hear the silence of doubt pressing on their hearts even before the first shots were fired. Then the storm broke. Energy lances from the Zorath cut through destroyers in an instant, splitting ships open like toys, sending men and women spinning into the void with no chance of rescue. Squadrons of human fighters raced forward only to be torn apart in flashes of light, and for a moment it seemed that Mercer's plan would collapse before it even began. But then, with a roar that seemed to shake the bones of everyone who heard it, the first wave of asteroids was launched. Massive rocks, some larger than cities, glowed with the fire of warp coils strapped to their sides, their unstable drives screaming as they tore through space, faster than any ship had ever moved. The Zorath fleet, so disciplined and proud, had no time to adjust, no warning in their doctrine for such madness, and when the first rock slammed into the forward line, the explosion was so bright it lit the darkness like a false sun. 3 cruisers shattered, a battleship spun in two before its engines detonated, and the carefully built formation broke like glass. Cheers erupted across the human channels, voices filled with disbelief and raw joy, and Mercer shouted above the noise for the second wave to fire. More asteroids flew, some spinning wildly, some breaking apart mid-flight, but enough struck home to turn order into chaos. Shards of stone, glowing plasma warheads, and broken enemy hulls filled the void, turning the battlefield into a graveyard of fire. Inside the Endeavor, alarms screamed, panels flickered, and the smell of burning circuits filled the air as enemy fire rained down on them. Arya Chen clung to her console, shouting that the warp coils were overheating, that they would tear the ship apart if they kept pushing. But Mercer only laughed through the smoke and bellowed back, "Then cool them with beer if you have to." And the crew laughed too, even in the face of death, because the madness was what kept them alive. They kept launching, kept throwing, every ship that could still move joining the storm, until the Zorath were forced to scatter and retreat, something their proud commanders had never done before. For the first time in the long history of the galaxy, the perfect blades of the Zorath wavered, their lines bent, their weapons forced to turn defensive instead of cutting forward. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a miracle of survival, bought with desperation, laughter, and the kind of stubborn courage that only humans carried into the night. In that storm of fire and stone, the galaxy watched and understood why the words "hold my beer" had become a warning. Because against every calculation and against every law of reason, the impossible was happening before their eyes. The battlefield had already become a storm of fire and broken metal when the true terror of the Zorath finally appeared. Sliding out of the void like a shadow that swallowed stars, their flagship, a leviathan so vast it seemed more like a floating moon than a ship, its armored plates gleaming black and silver, its weapons arrays stretching across miles, each one powerful enough to shatter continents. The moment it arrived, the battle stilled for a breath, human channels falling silent, alien observers gasping. Even the debris seemed to pause as if space itself bowed to the monster's presence. The ship's first volley fired. A lance of energy brighter than lightning, and a cluster of human frigates vanished in the blaze, turned to dust before their captains even had a chance to scream. The power of the weapon was so absolute that for a moment despair swept through the human fleet like a cold wind, and even the boldest hearts began to falter. On the Endeavor, alarms howled, lights flickered red and smoke filled the air. But in the middle of it all stood Mercer, eyes fixed on the giant that threatened his people. In his hand was the last card, the final piece of madness that could either save them or end them all. A single asteroid wired to the most unstable prototype warp core ever built. A weapon so dangerous the Galactic Council had outlawed its creation long ago. A weapon that even human engineers had buried in shame. It pulsed on the holotable like a heart about to burst. blue light crackling across its surface, its core already screaming with the power of tearing space itself apart. Arya Chen's face was pale in the flickering light, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Sir, that thing will kill us all." But Mercer's eyes did not leave the massive shadow of the enemy flagship. He let her words hang in the air, then smirked with the stubbornness that had carried him this far, his voice low but steady as he said, "Probably, but if it works," and he did not finish because he did not need to. The crew knew what he meant. If it worked, it would change everything. He gave the order, and the asteroid was armed, the warp core inside it glowing so bright that even the machines monitoring it warned of total collapse. The crew held their breath as the great stone was launched into the void, its engines whining, space bending in ripples around it, every calculation saying it should detonate too early, every law of reason insisting it could not reach its target. But humans had never cared for reason. The asteroid tore forward, a comet of fire and madness, and the Zorath flagship turned its weapons to destroy it. Beams of energy ripping through space, smashing smaller rocks, tearing apart fragments, but the main body kept flying, faster and faster, the core inside it screaming louder as though daring the universe to stop it. On the Endeavor, Mercer leaned forward like a pitcher on a field, his voice a whisper but filled with a weight that carried through the comms. "Batter up." The asteroid struck. For one blinding instant, the stars vanished, replaced by a light so great it washed out everything. Brighter than the sun, hotter than the heart of a star, the warp core collapsed and tore itself apart, ripping open the void in a violent explosion that devoured the flagship whole. The monster of steel and shadow was shredded in seconds, its body broken into shards that spun out into the black. The shockwave blasted across the battlefield, tearing apart thousands of Zorath ships, sending survivors scattering like insects before a fire. And when the light finally faded, the Endeavor was still there, battered, broken, its crew bloodied but alive, drifting in the silence of victory bought with madness. When the light of the great explosion faded and the echoes of the shockwave died away into the endless black of space, a silence heavier than any battle settled over the system, a silence so deep that it felt as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. Where once had hung the mightiest ship of the Zorath Armada, there was now only a field of glowing wreckage, shards of steel and flame drifting like broken teeth scattered across the stars. The rest of the fleet, those thousands of ships that had come with such certainty of victory, was in chaos, half of them destroyed by the blast, the others fleeing without order, their discipline shattered along with the pride of their flagship, and in the center of it all, drifting scarred and battered, engines flickering weakly, hull torn and bleeding sparks into the void, the human dreadnought Endeavor still lived. Inside, the crew were wounded, weary, covered in soot and sweat, but they were laughing, coughing through the smoke with voices hoarse from shouting, laughing as if they had just pulled off the greatest trick the stars had ever seen. Some of them cried as they laughed, their tears carving clean lines through the ash on their faces, not because they thought they would live long, but because they had seen the impossible happen and had been a part of it. Mercer sat slumped in his command chair, ribs aching, one arm wrapped against his chest, blood staining the sleeve of his uniform, but the same grin that had carried his people through still shone on his face. He looked at the wreckage of the enemy, then at his crew, and with a dry, broken chuckle he whispered, "Told you it would work." The words spread like a ripple through the room, and even Arya Chen, who had cursed him a dozen times that night and believed him mad every step of the way, found herself smiling through tears as she shook her head at him, whispering, "You're insane, Commander." He gave no denial, for he knew she was right. Across the galaxy, word of the battle spread faster than any fleet, carried by frightened scouts, by trembling sensors, by the whispers of those who had watched from afar. On Xiren, the insect generals stopped their rituals and stared at the stars in fear. On the icy worlds of the Varaxi, armored warriors went silent and bowed their heads, no longer mocking the humans they had once called soft. Even the machine intellects, who claimed to feel nothing, ran their calculations again and still could not explain how such an act could be possible. The phrase, "hold my beer," was entered into their records not as a joke, not as a cultural note, but as a coded warning of ultimate threat, a trigger for maximum defense, for when humans said those words, the impossible could no longer be measured. Protocols were rewritten across the galaxy. Do not engage, do not challenge, and most of all, do not underestimate. And yet, in the ruins of their ship, the humans did not think of how the galaxy now feared them. They thought only of Earth, of the people waiting for them, of the oceans and skies they had nearly lost, and of the simple, stubborn truth that had carried them this far, that giving up was never an option. The galaxy would remember this day as a day of madness, of terror, of a species that defied reason itself. But for Mercer and his crew, it was the day they had protected their home with nothing but courage, desperation, and the willingness to try the unthinkable. And so the universe learned in fire and in fear that when humans said, "Hold my beer," even the stars had reason to tremble.